anybody that's familiar. I'm close to Hocking Hills for anyone that's familiar with that. It's sort of my local stomping grounds. I have a YouTube channel, which is predominantly focused definitely on landscape photography, a little bit of education, little mini gear reviews and things. Lead various workshops in Ohio, West Virginia, Great Smoky Mountains, and out west in Death Valley. And mention the podcast. I am a co-host of the Shutter Nonsense podcast, which is a nature photography podcast that I co-host with Michael Rung, where we talk about all sorts of different topics on nature photography. And well, we try to keep a fairly laid back way, nothing too formal. So what we're going to present today is we're going to talk about why camera setup matters. And this is one of those things that I see a lot of frustration on workshops. You'll get people that understand a lot of the basics, but the controls aren't where they should be or could be, or they don't know what should be close and what should be further away. And that's just an area of frustration I've seen. So as I've done these workshops, I've started including more about some best practices for how to get your camera sort of in a good starting point. Everyone's got their different preferences to what that should be, but I try to cover the basics here. And so in this presentation, we're going to talk about some of those basics. Some will be review. Some of you are probably more advanced photographers. There'll be a little bit of review, but I think you'll get something out of this just from some of the things that I think are reasonable defaults to sort of start with, why you might want to change them, and putting things in quick access menus and things like that. And we'll talk a little bit more about why I think this, though it's more technical in nature, is very important in order to free up your creativity. So as we get into that, first we've got modern cameras. And as modern cameras have advanced, we've started to get advanced focus options. We've got focus stacking. We've got different focus areas. We've got single servo focus, continuous focus. And we just continue to get more and more options. We get things like exposure bracketing so that you can do multiple exposures and capture those high dynamic range scenes, which again, it's more added complexity to your camera menus and more options to think about and consider. And they just continue to add computational controls in there with, HDR modes, and you can configure just so many things in a modern camera that it starts to become sort of a sense of overwhelm. And you just get so many of these decisions about how do I configure the camera when what we really want to do is capture interesting scenes, interesting landscape photography. And as these menu options start to pile on, it's really easy to get overwhelmed and sometimes get a little frustrated. The camera can start to become a blocker to you getting your creativity out there as opposed to actually a tool. And even our normal functions, I felt like cameras used to be a little more simple back in the day before the digital came along and we started getting all these options. But even just our basics, our exposure modes and our settings and our shutter speed, aperture, ISO, those can all be, those are settings that are very important to us, but still things that take a little bit of thought. Focus modes and focus points. Landscape photographers might have one approach to a focus mode and a focus point versus someone photographing sports or portraits or something like that. I'm going to be approaching this from a landscape photography perspective, and that's where a lot of my emphasis is on. But if you're not a landscape photographer and you're a street photographer or something like that, I think a lot of these things I'm going to talk about today are relevant. Just you might choose a different starting point than what I would recommend, because I'm going to be recommending more towards landscape photography, but still going to be pieces I think you can walk away from this presentation and hopefully be able to use the camera as a tool and it not be in your way while you're practicing whichever genre of photography you like. White balance is another one. This is a question I get a lot, especially in landscape photography. What should my white balance be? And, configuring it and changing it. And in color profiles in the camera can impact certain settings in the camera. So this is a setting that doesn't get thought about often, but it's handy to be aware of. And I think for landscape photography, choosing certain defaults will help you get better use out of the tools. And we'll talk about that as we go through the presentation. And like I said, and the list goes on. Key point being, when you have all of these settings, it's real easy for your camera to feel overwhelming. And like I said, I'm pretty sure we all started this so we can go out and take amazing pictures of interesting scenes, whether it be waterfalls or a local metro park, or if you travel for it, you've got a vision that you want to execute and implement. And taking a little bit of time to come up with some practical starting points with your camera and your menu systems can help you be less overwhelmed and be able to focus back on that creativity. You can focus on the composition, you can focus on the scene, and you can focus on the fast changing light if you have sort of a practical set of defaults and a good setup on your camera. So that's why I sort of stress this. I think it's one of those things where once you sort of get it under get a system figured out, it quickly fades in the background and you can focus on these more interesting artistic pieces and parts of photography, that composition in the scene and telling the story. So for me, it really comes down to these predictable starting points. These are the things that I think give you a nice foundation to work from and help you react to fast moving light.
Yes.
Um,
Because then when I came back from my vacation,
I'm sorry. Somebody needs to
sure.
mute there. You need to mute.
around their COS. Oh, they're
Christy?
okay.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. So coming into this, to be upfront, we probably all photograph on different cameras and things like that. There's Nikon, Canon, Lumix, Fujifilm, Sony. So going into this talk, the key thing I want to stress here is the concept and not necessarily how to configure it specifically on a certain camera. I'm a Nikon shooter, and if I share a whole bunch of Nikon screens and buttons, that's not going to help someone photographing on a Canon or a Sony. So my key thing I want people to take away from here is what settings should I be looking at and considering and putting on these predictable starting points, less about specifically what menu. If you pick up these terms I'm going to talk about, some of these key points, you can easily reference your user's manual or Google, how do I configure this on a Canon R50 or something like that. Because things could be named differently in your menus. The different brands will name it differently. But again, we're going to focus on the concept and the core pieces that really don't change across camera systems. And really, at the end of the day, regardless of camera, when it comes to landscape photography, the underlying concepts are all really the same. We've got to get a good exposure because that gives us a lot of data to work with. We want to be sure we get an acceptably in focus image. And there are certain settings we can use to help influence that. White balance has a play in this. So I sort of have some recommendations of where I like to set my white balance so that things are consistent. And we're going to talk about that. Stability, which is just means, are you going to be shooting from a tripod, which might have one set of best practices, or are you going to be shooting handheld, which might have another set of best practices? And then some shutter release techniques to help improve your landscape photography as well. These are the core concepts that are going to be the same on any camera system, even if there's subtle variance in what the camera brand refers to them as. So again, we're going to be talking about concepts, not specific menus. We're going to be honing in on those predictable starting points, not so much model specific setup. And then when I talk about these, I'm going to talk about what to set and why it matters as we go through here. So before we get fully into it, I do make one assumption about file format when you photograph, when you're using your camera. And we've got RAW file formats and we've got JPEG file formats. Several of the settings that I recommend in this setup or as a starting point rely on you photographing in a RAW file format. And that's essentially an unprocessed file that contains all of the data of the scene in front of you. And the advantages to that, it'll give you a little bit more dynamic range, gives you a flexible white balance, which is going to be key when we get to my white balance section. And it gives you better recovery of highlights and shadows if you shoot in this RAW format. And that's opposed to JPEG format, which does have smaller files and can have faster turnaround. If you're photographing in RAW, one of the downsides is you're going to have to do some editing to it because by default, a RAW file is going to be sort of flat, neutral, and it's going to take some post-processing to turn it into an image that you're going to share on social media or put on your website or, share with your friends. But the JPEG, because of how it works, those smaller files it does that by compressing the data. So you sort of lose some of the data in the image in a JPEG file versus a RAW file. So raw files, what I assume, and for when I instruct people, I always advise them to set their camera to raw. Now, with that said, that can make people nervous if you've never shot in raw file format before, because there is post processing. And sometimes when you shoot in JPEG, that picture in the camera just looks good and is almost share ready right away. So if you're nervous about it, most cameras have a way to set your camera to photograph in RAW plus JPEG. And that way, when you take an image, you'll have the raw file that you can work with, experiment with, try to learn this techniques with. But you'd have the JPEG to share right away if you wanted, or if you just get frustrated with editing a raw file, you have that JPEG there, sort of a safety net. When I first started shooting raw, I did raw plus JPEG because I was one of those nervous folks initially. And so there's nothing wrong with it. The raw file just gives you the ability to recover things a little more easily, fix some white balance problems, and just gives you a lot more flexibility. First up, the most important thing of any photography is getting that exposure just right, and that is obviously going to be some of the settings that we want close at hand, and it's very important to understand those, because if you want to ultimately be successful in landscape photography or any photography, if you're starting from a good exposure, a solid exposure, you're going to do way less saving the file, saving the image, trying to get it to look okay, to being able to edit it to your style, to what you saw and what you wanted to do. So we're going to talk about exposure first. Some of this will be review, but I always like to cover it because I find sometimes people don't ask questions when they have some uncertainties or anything like that. So I do just want to touch on exposure because I do think it's such a foundational part of being successful in photography, to understand it. And once it's second nature, it just becomes much easier to do the fun part of photography. So reason you want a good exposure is because it captures the data that you'll work with later, and you want as much data as possible. If you have things that are too dark, you start to lose data, so you can't get the detail back. Likewise, if it's too bright in the scene, you start to lose data and you can't recover that. So you want to try to find exposures that have the most amount of data you can have in that file, because that helps you when you go to edit the file. Gives you all that flexibility in post-processing by protecting those highlights and shadow detail. And then I've just got sort of a sample here. On the left side, we've got sort of an underexposed image. The middle image, sort of a well-exposed image. The whites aren't too white. The darks aren't too dark. And then on the right, we've got an image that's a little overexposed. The water started to blow out. We've started to lose that detail, meaning if I took that image on the right and brought it into Photoshop or Lightroom or your favorite editing program, I would start to get some weird gray areas on that water because I didn't quite capture it right. On the far left, I've got some really black blacks in there where it might be a little difficult to lift those shadows and bring them out. Whereas the middle image, I've got plenty of light data, plenty of shadow data. So when I go to edit it, I can manipulate the file and have more room to make those manipulations with. So the controls that work together, this is the classic exposure triangle. We got your aperture, your shutter speed, your ISO. This is probably pretty familiar to most folks. These is sort of, the building blocks of photography. They're sort of our levers. If we change aperture one way, we can use shutter speed or ISO to adjust the other. So these are sort of our building blocks to help us get to a well-exposed image. So controls for your aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, it's important to know, be familiar with where those buttons are on your camera so that you can easily change them, because these are probably the settings we change the most often in photography. Aperture, just as a bit of a review, affects how much light gets into the camera. It's got the little diaphragm and the lens there. The wider open it is, something like an f2.8, more light gets in. If you make it a smaller aperture, like an f11, less light gets in, and that's one of our controls to get to a proper exposure. Now, we balance the amount of light in aperture with the depth of field aspect of things, because aperture also controls how much is acceptably sharp. A aperture like an f2.8, that's a very narrow depth of field. You'll use it a lot in portraits or maybe for astrophotography, where you want more light in the camera. and it also sort of blurs the background a little bit to make your subject stand out. Works really well for portraits. As you start to get into landscape photography, though, you start to lose things out of focus. You might start to lose those front trees out of the being out of focus or something like that. So our aperture is one of our tools to control light for the exposure and depth of field, which for landscape photographers is important. And we'll talk about where I sort of aim for to start out on an aperture in a little bit. Shutter speed is one of our other controls for exposure. Controls how much light gets to the sensor. A slower shutter speed, more light gets to the sensor. Faster shutter speed, less light gets to the sensor. The other variable for it is movement. It affects motion. So when you're thinking about your shutter speed and where you're going with it, you've got to consider movement. And there's two different types of movement to consider. There's when we're photographing the scene, what is moving in our scene? In this particular case, there's a waterfall. The one on the left, I have a faster shutter speed, so it sort of froze the water. You start to see more droplets. There's less flow to it because I used a faster shutter speed on that left image. On the right image, it blurs the movement because I let the shutter stay open longer and the water moves through the frame and you get that blurred look. So that's one way motion, shutter speed impacts motion of what you're photographing in your frame. Sometimes if you have a windy day and you've got some grasses or some leaves and they're getting blown by the wind, you typically would want to freeze that. So that would lead you to move towards a faster shutter speed in order to freeze that movement. The other variable for shutter speed is is your camera on a tripod or is it handheld? When you're hand holding, a lot of times you're going to want a little faster shutter speed in order to keep the camera stable because you're hand holding and you might be a little shaky or something like that. So that'll lend itself to a faster shutter speed. So that shutter speed helps our exposure, and we have to think about movement, either what's moving in our scene or am I moving the camera for some reason? And finally, ISO is sort of the last setting that we want to keep close at hand, and it's what we can use to balance off. I always tell people, really, you want to think about your aperture and shutter speed to do what you want to do creatively with the scene. Let's take that waterfall, for example. A lot of times I like my waterfalls to be a little smooth, so I know I want a slower shutter speed. I know for my aperture, I want my depth of field to be, f8, f11. So already I'm getting those practical starting points in my head, right? I've got an f8, f11 for my aperture. I've got a slower shutter speed so I can get that blur I want in the water. If you like a waterfall that's not quite as smooth, you might want a faster shutter speed. Once I start to get those two, now we're going to talk about how to measure the exposure, but your last little tool to help adjust that is your ISO. And what ISO is, it takes the light that hits the sensor. So if you're ISO 100, your base ISO or something like that, that's a very clean image. It's essentially recording the light that hits the sensor with minimal digital interpretation. If you start to move your ISO up, it starts to boost that captured light. So you're taking the light that hits the sensor and you're essentially amplifying it by turning that ISO up. So maybe go to ISO 400, maybe ISO 800. That's how you sort of get to the exposure you want once you've decided on where you're at with your aperture and your shutter. Now, the downside of ISO is it does, as you increase it, it's also boosting any kind of noise that's in that light. So any of that light you captured, any noise, it's going to have the effect of boosting that as well. So I always tell people, yes, you want to try to get to your base ISO and ISO 100. Some cameras will do ISO 64, but don't be afraid to go up with it. The modern cameras are very flexible with ISO, and it's a very valid tool to help you get the exposure you need for the scene you're photographing. We'll touch a little bit on that a little bit more. So putting all those together, that was the review of the exposure triangle, probably fairly familiar to a lot of folks, but it all plays into the things that we care about as landscape photographers. First up, you've got the changing light. And this is why I like to stress making sure these settings are sort of second nature. Make sure you know which dials are changing what. On my camera, I have to hit the ISO button and then move a dial to change my ISO. you want that to be easy to do. You don't want to have to think a whole lot about it. It's even if you sit on your living room couch and just play with changing camera settings while you watch TV or something so that it starts to become second nature, it just helps you when things start to move fast. Everyone thinks landscape photography is nice and slow, right? We show up to sunrise or sunset nice and early. We're waiting either in the dark or waiting for the sun to go down. But I think it's only us landscape photographers that realize just how fast the light really moves. Once that sun starts to get just where we want it, it feels like it's moving really, really fast. And we're needing to make these changes on our camera relatively quickly to keep up and keep things well exposed. And that's why I stress understanding that exposure triangle and making sure we have those are familiar with where we're changing those settings, make sure they're easy to get to and familiar with them, because that light moves pretty quick when we get to certain times of day, as the sun comes up or as the sun goes down. Dynamic range is important, being able to capture, realizing where the shadows are at, where the brights are at. And as the day moves more quickly, so as the sun comes up, that dynamic range increases. The shadows are getting darker because the sun's getting higher and the sun's getting brighter, making it bright. And we start to get this much more spread out dynamic range, which presents some challenges that we'll talk about in a bit. And in depth of field considerations, again, aperture impacts our depth of field. In this particular scene here, this is in Alabama Hills, in California outside of Lone Pine. And this needed a lot of depth of field. It's a focus stacked image because I had texture very close and very to me in the form of the arch. And then I have the mountain off in the distance. So that's why I have to think about the aperture. For this particular scene, it was one of the strong considerations for how I needed to set my camera settings. And in motion, this particular case, I was on a tripod, so my motion consideration was not a lot because I'm photographing a rock, mountains in the background. There's no water, there's no leaves or trees blowing or anything like that. So I didn't have to think a whole lot about shutter speed from a motion standpoint as much as the how much light am I getting into the camera standpoint. But those are the key things we think about as landscape photographers. So let's talk about the predictable settings. Again, these are starting points. These aren't like, don't leave here thinking, well, Jeffrey said you have to shoot f8. That is not what I'm saying. I am saying you can ballparkish. I like to be starting around f8. And the reason I say f8 is because sometimes you'll bring that back down to f5, 6, because maybe something's way off in the distance and you don't need a ton of depth of field from it. So you might bring it down to f5, 6. What it keeps you from doing by thinking and starting around the f8 range, it keeps you from having to make big swings in the field. A lot of times I end up at f11 or something like that because I want the depth of field from that. So f8 is just a starting point. That is not if I'm not shooting f8, I'm doing it wrong. It's start there as you think through the scene. How much depth of field do I need? Shutter speed varies for me depending on whether it's a tripod or handheld. Tripod, you can do much slower shutter speeds because you've got a stable platform. If you're shooting handheld, you need to watch that shutter speed a little more closely. The old rule of thumb was 1.5 times your focal length. So if you were shooting at 100 millimeter focal length, you would want to be shooting at a 1/150th shutter speed or higher in order to be steady. I drink a lot of coffee, so I tend to do 2x when I was doing that. We're going to talk a little bit later about in-body image stabilization. It sort of changed the rules a little bit, but it still doesn't change that on a tripod, you can have much slower shutter speeds because your camera is steady. If you're photographing handheld, you want to consider, are you introducing any movement to your camera that you need to consider? And of course, movement and frame that we talked about, moving water that you want to have a long exposure effect on, or it's windy out and you don't want those leaves, flowers, trees, or anything like that moving in your frame. So you have to freeze them by using a faster shutter speed. Then I start base ISO 100 on one of my cameras, ISO 64 on the camera they'll do it. That's where I start. That's where I would prefer to be. But if after making my decision about aperture and shutter speed, I need to raise my ISO, I have no hesitation to do so because it's important to get that image. Okay. So we've talked a whole bunch about exposure, right? And probably, like I said, probably a fair amount of that was, yep, fairly comfortable with shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Where I start to see people start to sometimes have some questions is how do we know if I've got a good exposure? I've said a lot here. You want to get a good exposure, but what is a good exposure? What tools should we have enabled on our camera to get that good exposure? How do I measure it? And the camera gives us several feedback tools, and they vary slightly how they do it. And they're both good. You just sort of have to understand what the camera is doing when it shows you these feedback tools so that you can make important decisions. At the end of the day, the camera is still just a little miniature computer and doesn't always know what we're actually looking at. It just can look at tones and light and it can make certain preset determinations, but we're the people that look at it and go, okay, I know what the scene is. Sometimes I have to tell the camera something a little different because I understand what I'm photographing. So we're going to talk about those two things um, that I think are very key and you want accessible. But one common mistake I see is people relying heavily on their LCD. So with the advent of mirrorless, that can sort of give you that what you see is what you get. You can see your exposure settings sometimes real time. Um, I see people start to fall in the trap of, well, it looks good on the back of the screen. It must be good. Unfortunately, the LCD, if it's very bright, in this particular scene here, if this LCD is very bright, it might make those trees look like they're exposed well, but in reality, it's just the bright LCD makes them look good. And when I get the picture home and look at it, it's underexposed. So the LCD can be misleading, and it's a trap I see people fall into sometimes with that. It can go the other way too. If your screen is too dim, you can find yourself boosting your exposure to try to get it to look right on the back of the camera. But it's a very subjective thing and heavily influenced by your LCD brightness level. Now, there are some LCD tools we can use in review mode we'll touch on, but looking just at is the back of the screen look properly exposed is a common trap. And it just leads to people getting frustrated because they are out in the field, they see the back of the camera like this looks great, and then they get it home and find out they underexposed or overexposed an image. And then that just goes to hurt your creativity in the field, right? Because again, the camera starts to become a frustration as opposed to a tool to help you create what you want to create. So the most common one's a light meter. This has been around, film cameras had light meters. This is the very common one. And if you understand what the light meter is doing, it can be a great tool to get into the ballpark of the exposure you want. And light meter in the camera, it's measuring a reflected light. So you've got your scene in front of you, light's reflecting back. And this little section right here, just above the ISO 100 is your light meter. If everything's right underneath the 0, then the camera thinks you have a well-exposed image. This particular screenshot I have here, it's way off to the left. So the camera thinks whatever it's looking at right now is very underexposed. And then likewise, if you're off to the right, the camera would think it's overexposed. And this is one of a good tool to help you know, am I getting the right amount of light into the camera? What it's doing, though, is again, the camera doesn't really know what you're looking at. It only knows I'm getting this reflected light into the camera, and it's programmed to think this color swatch over here is middle gray. What it's trying to do is set your settings or tell you that the scene is either darker than middle gray, right at middle gray, or brighter than middle gray. So as long as you know that is what it's doing, it can help you in situations where the light meter is more easily tricked or more easily fooled. So when the light meter struggles is in very bright scenes, because in a very bright scene, it sees very bright, sees a lot of the tones are brighter than middle gray. So it starts to try to underexpose the scene. It makes things a little dark. You'll see this a lot with bright, snowy days. If you see a lot of times, you'll go out with your camera, you'll watch your light meter, you'll get it to where it thinks, you get home and you find out all your snow pictures look like they're gray. And that's because the light meter saw bright white, which was what was in the scene, but because it only knows I should make it look middle gray, it underexposes a little bit, giving you that gray snow. Very dark scenes, it does the opposite thing. It looks at a very dark scene and it goes, this scene is too dark. I need to slow a shutter down, change my aperture, or, on the light meter, if you're in manual mode, choosing, it's going to read that it's too dark and you need to expose more. When reality is you're looking at a dark scene, you know that yes, it's going to be, it is a slightly underexposed scene. There's more darks in it. It's not a middle gray scene. And then high contrast scenes can confuse it as well, where you've got some bright elements in part of the scene and some dark elements. As it tries to even that out, it can get you into some interesting circumstances. So again, light meter can get you in the ballpark. Make sure it should be displayed on the back of your camera so you can see it, because it does get you in the ballpark of things. Now, how the light meter registers the scene depends on your mode setting, and this is where I recommend a default for people for their light metering mode. So a camera has multiple light metering modes, and this is what in the scene is the camera looking at to take it to middle gray. On Nikon, it's called matrix metering. I believe Sony and Canon are going to call it evaluative metering. And this is where it shows, it looks at the whole scene and it tries to make the whole scene that middle gray. So the light meter's evaluating the whole scene. So in this particular sample picture, I've got it pointing at a lamp on the desk, and it's trying to balance that whole scene out. The darks that were over towards the right, the bright of the light itself, and trying to even it out. If you do center weighted metering, it brings emphasis to the center of the scene, and that's what it's trying to meter to. So same scene, same setup, center weighted metering, and you can see it darkened the edges. It vignetted this scene because it was focused in on that bright light in the center, and that's what it was trying to evaluate to read the light meter off of. So when you change one of these light metering modes, it impacts how your light meter reads the scene. And in spot metering, in this particular case, it's hard to see probably on the slide, but there's a little bear to the right of the light. I put my spot on the bear, which was normally in the dark in the shadow. And now it's trying to read the light right off of that spot. So it brings everything up. It's trying to make that one little spot hit that middle gray. So you can see that light in the center suddenly gets really bright, pretty much blown out in the center. So I've lost detail. If this was a landscape image, I wouldn't be able to get that detail back. There are handy times for spot metering, but that's what it's doing when you do spot metering. And then some cameras have something called highlight priority, which is where it would look at the whole scene and only evaluate for the brightest spot automatically. So it sort of skips the spot. You don't have to move it over the bright scene. It'll just register for the highlight priority. Not all cameras have that particular setting. My recommendation for your best starting point for your light meter is the matrix or evaluative mode. I find in 90% of the cases, it gets me to where I want to be, helps make my camera predictable because it's looking at the whole scene. So when you're setting your camera up, in order to get the light meter to react, what I think is the most predictable for what I'm looking at in landscape photography, matrix or evaluative mode is where I head. Again, there's exceptions to that. I think in non-landscape photography genres, portraits potentially different if you're doing kind of stage photography, photographing performances. There's reasons to change, but landscape photography, I find matrix or evaluative mode gets you the best starting point to move forward. And the last little thing to touch on here is exposure compensation. Now, this plays in a lot less with manual mode. This doesn't impact manual mode as much because we're sort of doing the mental part when we're in manual mode. It's more for if you're using aperture priority mode or shutter priority mode. I actually use aperture priority when I shoot handheld a reasonable amount because I'm moving more quickly usually then, and the auto settings on cameras are pretty good these days. So I do like to touch on exposure compensation because it can be handy. But essentially what exposure compensation doing is you're sort of going to tell, it's a meter correction tool. You can tell the camera, no, overexpose this scene a little bit, or you can tell it underexpose the scene a little bit. And this is where we as the photographer, we know what we're looking at. So in that case of photographing bright snow, we know we might want to tell the camera, no, that's supposed to be bright. It's okay to overexpose the scene on this because it's supposed to be bright. So again, it lets us tell the camera we know what we're looking at. How's it work? You typically adjust your um, so it starts at 0. If you're not using exposure compensation, it's 0. Cameras try to take things to a middle gray. You can adjust it unseen brightness. So, like again, on snow or bright skies, if you're photographing out in the desert and you've got big blue skies, it's going to be a very bright scene. We, as the photographers, see that it's bright, and that's okay. We're going to want to tell the camera, it's okay, overexpose this scene a little bit. I don't want you to darken it because you think it should go to gray. It is a bright scene. So, you would change your exposure compensation up, maybe up to a stop or 2/3 of a stop. Similar with dark scenes, if you're photographing a very dark scene, you don't want it bringing it up so much. You'd want to compensate negatively. So you'd want to say underexpose this scene by 2/3 of a stop or a stop. So that's what exposure compensation is. I'd like to keep it handy and close, especially if you're like me and you do use aperture priority, especially for handheld for me. It's handy to have close. It's usually a button on your camera. You press it and give it a couple clicks and help it overexposed or underexposed. But that's when exposure compensation comes into play, when the scene has got trending towards the extremes on one side or the other. Now, this is the tool, the histogram, is what really changed my photography back in the day. Up until I really learned how to use the histogram, I felt like I was guessing at exposures. Exposure compensation makes way more sense to me now. I understand more what the light meter does over the years and how it's actually acting and reacting. And I can get pretty close to the light meter because I know what it's doing and get pretty close. But if I want to be as precise as I can and try to maximize the data, the histogram is probably the single biggest thing that made a technical improvement in my photography over the years. Again, the histogram is another feedback tool on your exposure. So to tie things together, we've talked about exposure, why exposure is important, and we've moved into how do I know if I'm getting a good exposure? You keep saying good exposure. Histogram is a feedback tool that helps us know if we're getting a good exposure, and it comes into your practical settings because most cameras, if you're mirrorless, you can almost always get the histogram to show up on the back of the camera. On this picture here, it's down there in the lower right of the LCD there on the camera that's pictured. And this is one of those configurations you'd want to make. So you would Google camera model, histogram, live view. If you're on a slightly older DSLR, you might not be able to get it on the LCD, or if you're a viewfinder shooter, you might not be able to get it in the viewfinder. But I'll show you in playback mode how it works as well. But let's talk about the histogram because I do think this is super important, and sometimes people get confused with the graphs. But the histogram is showing us the tones in our scene, so showing us the distribution. On this sample here, we've got the shadows on the left. So these are our darks, got our midtones, and we've got our highlights. Goal being we want as much data as possible as we can in the image. So we don't want things too far off to the right. If it goes way far off to the right, that means we're losing our highlights. We're losing data. We're not going to be able to edit. Our exposure is too bright. If we're way too far off in the shadows, then we're losing our blacks. We're losing that data that's in there, and we're probably underexposing our scene. So that's what the histogram is. Key point with the histogram, and this is why I mentioned picture profiles. And this is, you'll usually default to something like standard. But the histogram is based on the JPEG preview, not the raw file. So whatever you have set for your picture profile influences the JPEG. So if you have a flat picture profile, you can have a neutral. Flat it's a very low contrast one. It's the closest one you can get to look like the raw file. This is the one where your histogram is most close to what your raw file would be. Neutral gets a little more contrast, not too much more. Standard is what most cameras default to. So you'll have a picture profile. It's going to default to standard. It's what's being shown on your LCD on the back, and it's what the histogram is based off of. Landscape starts to get into a very contrast, vivid, vibrant image. But you can see as these images go across, the one on the left, you can see into these shadows behind the waterfall pretty good. And as we've started to move up the scale, we can see I've started to lose some of these shadows and my water gets brighter. So you can start to see that contrast building into there. And then vivid like that. So I mentioned this at this point is because this is a setting I recommend is doing a flat or neutral picture profile so that our histogram is the most accurate. Um, so again, I'm going to skip back to a picture of a histogram. So when you're photographing the field, you watch this histogram on the back of your camera, and you want to get that over towards the right, and you can use your aperture and shutter speed to get there. But if you keep that from going off the scale to the right, and you make sure you don't have your shadows off to the left, you can really be pretty confident in your exposure by using the histogram. Again, this is one of those things I recommend sitting in your living room and playing with a little bit, because you can sit there on the couch with your camera in hand, and just play with the dials. Watch that histogram. Watch how it moves when you change the shutter speed. Watch how it moves when you change your aperture. Then, once you sort of see how it works pointing at one spot, point at another spot in the room. Maybe go from a light spot to a dark spot and point to that, and then move those settings and see how it works. But learning how to use the histogram, making sure it's easily accessible, configuring your camera to have it accessible before you head out is it just will really help you out in the field, be super confident in his exposures. And again, why so much talk on the technical? Because once you feel good about your exposures, your mind is freed up to think about the creativity. It's freed up to think about those compositions. It's freed up to think about, what am I looking at and what do I want to show the person that's going to look at my photo. That's why I push in this particular presentation so much on the technicals, because if you get those as a foundation, it lets you do the more fun parts of landscape photography. So again, I recommend flat or neutral. Flat can look really, really boring when you're new to using flat. Even I sometimes on the back of my camera look at it and go, wow, that picture looks really not contrasty. I'll cheat sometimes and kick it over into standard just to see that, yep, this is going to be okay. I'm going to be able to do this. But if you're uncomfortable with flat or neutral, because this is a case where sometimes people will be in flat and they don't feel excited about their image, or they don't feel good about what's on the back of their camera, and it starts to have a negative impact on your thinking. I get that. Standard is a fine starting point, but I would actively avoid vivid or landscape while you work through this for picture profile. And again, we talked about maybe you can't get the histogram enabled in live view or something like that. Some DSLRs can't do that. It's almost always available in the image review screen. So this is when you hit play, you take your picture, you hit the review, playback review button. There's usually a mode that lets you see something similar to this where you can see the histogram. So in this case, what I recommend is you take your picture, hit your play button, and make sure you have it to cycle through to show you the histogram, and you can do it that way. Then you can make adjustments to what you were doing based off of this histogram and playback mode. Because that histogram there shows the top one shows the tone distribution, and then your reds, greens, and blues if they're evenly distributed as well. You can also enable highlight warnings. Again, one of the key things with getting good exposure is make sure you don't blow out the highlights. The highlight warnings, people call them blinkies or the zebras. If your camera has the ability to show that either in live view or in playback mode, that's worth doing, because it'll give you very immediate feedback that you're probably overexposing your image a little too much, and you'd want to speed up your shutter a little bit to lessen the light, or bump your aperture, from f11 to f13 or something to get that. So the blinkies are useful. And then this is something for me, I just think it makes people more efficient, is a lot of cameras are set to, as soon as you take the picture, it immediately shows you the image review. I actually recommend turning that off and just review intentionally. I sometimes think that breaks me out of my focus, breaks me out of my zone if I'm trying to take a picture and I'm trying to get my composition just right, and every time I click the button, it's immediately showing me my image review. I tend to recommend avoiding that. The other time it's handy is if you're doing a panorama, exposure bracketing, or any of those things. It's nice to not have that popping up right away, because you can always get to it by just hitting the play button. That's a bit of a personal preference one, but I do find it makes me more efficient in the field. Which takes us to exposure bracketing, because we've talked about scenes that are very high dynamic range. And this is when one exposure is not enough. So, for example, in this particular scene, this is a bracketed image. And if you were to look at it with one shot in the camera, the sun is super bright. The shadows were super dark down here around these trees. So, my histogram looked like very high and peaked on the right. So, my brights were too bright. And then over on the left, my shadows were too dark. And there was no setting I could make to get them all present in one histogram. So exposure bracketing is what you do when one exposure isn't enough. Very frequent when you're photographing into the sun for sunrise, sunset. That's when a lot of times you'll see this, or super high contrast scenes. Sunrise and sunsets, bright skies, deep shadows. If you're photographing mountain valleys or something like that, that can be a case where you get these high dynamic range scenes that you just can't get on the histogram just the way you want. So exposure bracketing is capturing multiple exposures of the scene. You're essentially going to expose for one of the features and then expose for the other and blend them later. So in this particular scene, I exposed once for the highlights, which is the sun getting set to rise over there. And I only exposed for the highlights. The darks are way too dark in this scene. And that's because in order to get the highlight information, I had to let things go super dark. But when I photograph this, I'm planning to take multiple exposures of the scene. So then I exposed for the shadows. So now you can see everything here in the front, but now my sky is all blown out. But that's okay because I have that data in this image. And then sort of a midtones exposure just to sort of have something in between. So 3 exposures in this particular case. And this is what you sort of have to do because our camera is technically limited by how much dynamic range it can capture. And that's why we take these multiple images. You can do this. Oh, and this is the post-processed image of me blending multiple images together to get it. So that was the highlights, midtones, shadows. I blend them in Lightroom and then do my edits, and I'm able to keep the whole tonal range from that image. Now, there's a couple ways to exposure bracket. You can do it manually, which is really just you take the picture at watching the histogram, exposing for the highlights. Then you're like, well, I want the midtone. So you slow that shutter, which is going to move that histogram to the right, and it's going to blow those highlights out. But you already captured those in the first image. Now you're going to get your midtones. Then if you still have some shadows that are tight, you can slow the shutter down a little more and get that. So you can do it manually. But the reason I bring it up here, because manually it's just as long as you have your shutter speed right at hand, it's easy to fix. Or you can do it automatically. Modern cameras can auto bracket, and it's a setting inside your menu. And this is one of those things I recommend. And I'll do a summary at the very end of what I recommend to be quick access. But exposure bracket's one I like to have quickly accessible. It can either be programmed to a button to let you change the settings, or it can be on a quick menu. But typically with an auto bracket, what you're configuring is how many shots do you want it to take and how far apart do you want the exposure. So in this particular screen, I have 5. It's going to do 5 shots, and each one is going to be 2 stops apart. So it's going to do a series of 5 shots, and it's going to have some scene that's very bright, some of them are very dark. And becoming familiar with your auto bracketing settings in your camera will help you at sunrises and sunsets. And then once you have those frames, if you haven't done that before, if you're an Adobe Lightroom user, it's pretty easy to merge them in Lightroom. Photoshop has tools you can merge them together as well. And you end up with one file that has all the data in it, and then you can do your normal post-processing to it. Predictable focus. Focus is important. You know, we've spent a bunch of time on exposure and how to do that, but landscape photographers and any photographer really, we want to know where our focus is at. We have different focus types. You can manually focus. I very rarely manually focus these days unless it's a very low light situation that my camera is struggling in. Otherwise, there's AFS, which is single servo focus. So your camera finds its focus and it stops. Once it finds it, it's done. It's not going to try to do it anymore. Just once it gets focus, it calls it good and it stops trying to focus. You have continuous focus, which is where it finds focus. And if you were to move the camera just a little bit or something were to move in your scene, the camera is going to keep trying to maintain that focus. For landscapes, I tend to recommend single servo focus. It's predictable, it's stable. Once I get my, landscapes are fairly slow moving. So once I get my focus locked in, I'm happy to have it just stay there and I'll watch for something interesting to happen with the light or something like that. So focus types are important. For landscapes, I tend to like AFS, single servo focus, because it's, like I said, predictable and stable. Focus area. This is one of those things that there's all sorts of things, especially with the advent of mirrorless cameras. We've got autofocus, and then we've got subject tracking on top of that, where we can track the human eye, we can track planes, we can track cars. For landscapes, for me, it's really pretty simple. I like to do single point focus, which is where I choose what I want to be in focus. I like that because it's very, very deliberate. Lets me choose where to put my focus point, what to focus on, and I have full control over that. Area focus, the camera's sort of choosing. It says, oh, is this your subject? I'll focus on it. And then if you refocus again, it tries to put it somewhere else. Just a little less predictable. It can make you a little less efficient in the field. I like to be able to put my single point where I want it. So I recommend single point focus for focus. And finally on focus, this is a big one, especially as you start to do those exposure brackets and you start to do panoramas, is back button focus. By default, most cameras, they're going to focus when you half press that shutter button. You half press, you get focused, then you take the picture. Well, back button focus separates the focus function from the shutter button, and you can put it on the AF on button here. So when I focus on one of my cameras, I put my single point where I want it. I press the AF on button until I get my little green square to show it's in focus, and then I can let go. And now half pressing the shutter is not going to change the focus or anything. And that's, again, where I find it super helpful. I was talking earlier, I was in Death Valley a couple of weeks ago, and some of those really low light days, it takes a little bit to get my focus to click right on what I want it on. And once I get it, I don't really want it to shift or move. So back button focus helps with that. So I do recommend, if you're not using it already, just playing with it, seeing what it works, how it works for you. Works really well for panoramas when you're taking multiple shots and you don't want that focus point to constantly be moving because you'll get a different focus plane. You want to get your focus and then have it be consistent as you work your way through your panorama. Low light focusing, like I said, I don't like once I get my focus in low light, I don't like it to go re-hunting for it. Where to focus. This can almost be a topic in and of itself, so I just want to touch on it here. It can get way more in-depth than this because there's how close is the subject to your lens and what's your focal length and what's your aperture. Rule of thumb, as long as you're in an f8, f11, you want to get your focus point about a third of the way into the frame, because typically about a third of what's in front of your focus point is going to be in focus, and what's beyond is going to be in focus. There are exceptions. If I was super, super close to this rock in this frame, things would start to change. But as a starting point, that's my recommendation. Get about a third of the way into the frame, get your focus, be around f8, f11. In a lot of cases, that's going to work unless you have an extremely strong foreground element and a wide angle lens. Focus stacking, this is what you do if you happen to have that strong element in front of the lens because it's got a lot of texture. In those cases, there are situations where just one image is not enough. You're not going to have everything in focus no matter how small you set your aperture for. So strong foreground elements is one of the big things. You'll see this a lot with wide angle lenses where you've got that wide angle, you're getting close to a rock or something, and the mountain's off in the background. Or just a texture-rich scene. The sand dunes in Death Valley is a great example. It's not so much you always have something super close. It's just very texture and rich from the beginning of the image all the way to the end. And it can be hard to capture that completely in focus with a single image. So how focus stacking works is you move your focus point through the frame. You start with what's closest to you. You get it in focus. You take your picture, and you work your way through the frame. You can do it manually. Or you can have it done automatically. And that's why I bring it up here, is because this is a setting that if your camera can do automated focus stacking, it's worth having it fairly handy to you because it's useful to have when you do need to stack these photos. Once you have these images captured, some cameras will blend them in camera, but a lot of cameras you need to blend them in post-processing. Photoshop can do it. There's a program called Helicon Focus that can do it, and there's a program called Affinity Photo that can do it. But this is a focus stacked picture here. You can see it's got lots of detail here in the front. This is at a place called Devil's Golf Course in Death Valley, and it's got lots of these salt deposits, high texture. There was no way to capture this in a single image, regardless of aperture. So I needed to do multiple images. I want to say this was maybe 8 images blended together in order to make it be crisp from the very front, which is very close to my lens, all the way to the mountains in the back to do that. Again, you can do it manually, or you can have the camera do it for you. This is a Nikon screen, but this is what I say. This is one of those settings that if your camera has this capability, I would recommend either mapping it to a button or putting it in a quick menu. Mine is in a quick menu, so when I need to do this, what Nikon calls it is focus shift shooting, I can just quickly go into menu. I set my focus point to the closest thing in my frame. I go to my quick menu, make one click, and it kicks off this focus step. I'm not going to dwell too much on these settings in here because it's different on cameras, but essentially what you're telling it is what's the most number of shots to take, what kind of width of focus should I be looking at, and that varies depending on camera brand, and just a couple other little settings. But it's worth looking at if you find yourself doing a lot of wide angle scenes, or if you're a macro photographer, you're probably used to this because macro photography has a very small depth of field. Predictable color and consistency. Let's talk real quick about white balance. So white balance is a big thing. There's color temperature images. It changes with the light conditions. And this is sort of a white balance scale. You've got your sunny to partly cloudy day sitting here in the middle, sort of a clean white, not a lot of temperature cast to the daylight setting here. And then you move to cooler light or warmer light off to the left. White balance is one of those things where I recommend setting it manually. I will say though, today auto white balance in cameras is really good. So if you're doing single frames of stuff, auto white balance can work, but I find manual to be more consistent. So when I'm doing something like one of those focus stacks, let me first say, I recommend starting with daylight. 5500, 5600K, your camera is either going to have a daylight setting like this is here, which is equal to about 5500K, or it'll have what's called a Kelvin setting, which is what those numbers are, 5500, 5600. Right in there is daylight. That's sort of a nice, clean look. Now, if you think that's a little too cool, you can make it a little warmer. You can adjust it to be more like a cloudy day, and it'll warm the picture up a little bit. Some people like that. That's what they want to see. As long as it's consistent is what I recommend. As long as you're shooting RAW, you can fix it later. This is one of those key things why RAW is important, is because white balance can be fixed later. JPEG can be tweaked, but not truly fixed. And why manual? Because if you're doing any kind of multiple exposure thing, whether it be bracketed images, either an exposure bracket, you don't want your white balance changing between images. It gets really frustrating. In this particular scene, that's a panorama. That's each individual shot of a panorama. If my white balance had been changing through that panorama, it would have been very frustrating to try to fix. So that's why I recommend a manual white balance. Again, as long as you shoot RAW, once you get it in Lightroom or Photoshop, you can warm it up if you want it warmer, or you can cool it down, but you're going to have a nice, very stable, consistent set of images to work with. Again, applies to focus stacks as well. Predictable stability. So vibration, it can impact your sharpness in a photograph. And where some of your stability options start to come in is single shot versus continuous. So when you press the shutter button, is it going to take one picture or is it going to take multiple pictures? You get one press, one photo. And this single shot is my default when I use a tripod because I want one. I've got a very stable platform and I just want it to take one picture. Continuous I find useful when I'm hand holding, because when I'm hand holding, I'm not shooting with any kind of delay. And as soon as I press the button, my camera can shift a little bit. But if I can hold it, usually that second or third frame will be pretty stable. So I will sometimes turn on continuous. And this is why I like this one on at least a quick menu. in order to change from single shot to continuous. Continuous for handheld for me because it gives me that ability to hold it, get nice and steady, press the button, and one of my continuous shots should be stable. Single shots, what I tend to do on a tripod. We talked earlier about image stabilization. This is another setting I like to have close at hand because it does help me shoot handheld with a slower shutter speed than you used to be able to do. And essentially what it's doing is it's letting you, the camera is controlling the stabilization of the sensor for you. So different cameras can do different bits. 5 stops is starting to become fairly common on newer cameras. So if you were shooting at 1/100th of a second, and that's what you had to have to shoot handheld, if you have a camera with in-body image stabilization of 5 stops, that means theoretically I could hand hold it all the way to 1/3 of a second. So that's just a huge improvement. And it's a noticeable difference if you're watching through the screen. It's another one you can play with at home is you can get a lens on your camera, hand hold it, and try it with image stabilization on and try it with image stabilization off. And you can see the difference. With it off, you'll see the scene moves. Whereas when you turn it on, it locks it in and keeps it stable. So I like to keep image stabilization handy. And the reason I keep it handy and you don't keep it on all the time is when you're on a tripod, there are certain situations, they're getting better, like the cameras, at realizing they're on a tripod, but there's still situations where, especially with a long lens, where when you recompose, the scene sort of drifts. And I like to turn the IBIS off in those situations, even when I'm on a tripod, because it helps me get my composition more stable. So that's why I keep that one close at hand, because I like it on for when I photograph handheld, and I like it off when I'm using my tripod. The other thing about stabilization and why you want to keep this close and handy is self-timer. If you're on a tripod and you press the button, nice solid tripods, it's pretty stable. But if you're doing a long exposure, that little bit of vibration from the time you press the shutter button and try to get your hand away, there's enough movement that it can make your photos just a little soft. So I like to have the self-timer on to about 2 seconds. And in that way, I can press it, let go, have my hands off the camera. 2 seconds later, the shot is taken, and presumably the camera's more stable. So I like to keep self-timer handy. I always shoot with a self-timer or an exposure delay on a tripod because it just helps keep that camera stable. So it's well worth having this one in a quick menu to access. I always use a delay or a self-timer on a tripod. And predictable access. So bring us into the home stretch here. Why so much talking about these settings and things like that is because we want predictable access. We want to reduce friction in the field. All of the settings I've gone over tonight are things I tend to change at some point in the field or want to be able to adjust. So I don't like them buried in menus. I want them in places I can reach them. So for me, I have certain settings mapped to my custom function buttons. Your camera will have a way to go in and map things to that. Some people like a lot of things tied to buttons. Some like them in quick menus. Nikons have the little I menu. I think Canon uses what's called the Q menu for a quick menu. And it's usually a little button you hit, and it gives you a quick access menu of like 6 or 7 things that you can tie in there. But all of this goes to reduce that friction in the field. If I feel like I need to focus stack something, I don't want to try to remember and dig through 6 menus to go find it. I want to know it's close at hand by either hitting a button or hitting a quick menu. That's what I want. It because me not having to spend time trying to remember what menu it's in lets me make a setting change and focus on the creative side. Which lends itself to faster field adjustments, less time being spent in the menus, being confused and looking for things. These are things you can set up at home before you're out in the field so that when you're out in the field, they're right at your fingertips. And again, the whole goal here is to try to get this technical piece to sort of be a foundation or easy to access so that they're right at your hand so you can focus on that creative side of the photography. So just to sort of recap, the camera defaults, these are starting points. Remember, these are just starting points and my recommendations. If you find yourself liking something one way or the other, make that your starting point. If you know, I always tend to bump it to one direction or the other, then just set your starting point. It's okay to not be exactly like I'm saying here. These are my recommended starting points. It's what works for me. I think they work for a lot of people, but I'm sure there's people with lots of experience on this in this presentation that have a different preference because of their years of experience, and that's fun. You still might want it mapped closely. You just might start from a different default. But file format, like I said, highly encourage RAW because it gives you that editing flexibility, lets you recover if you're off a little bit. And for the white balance piece, it's really important to be in RAW because you can actually change it. If you're uncomfortable with RAW, RAW plus JPEG is fine. Metering mode, matrix evaluative, that's sort of my go-to. For me, it feels predictable. My light meter tends to always act. I have to think about my scene and what is my light meter interpreting it as, but it's always consistent. If it's bright, I know it's trying to underexpose it. If it's dark, I know it's trying to overexpose it. And matrix evaluative, that's a great starting point in my opinion. Picture profile, again, because the histogram is actually reading off of the JPEG preview, even if you're shooting RAW, it's still taking that picture profile for that histogram. So flat or neutral is what I like, but I understand flat can sometimes be very boring looking on the back of the camera. And if that frustrates you, if you need to go to standard, that's fine. Try to avoid though the vivid and the landscapes. And again, white balance, I like daylight. I find that works out well. Some people though are going to think that's too cool. Some people like warmer images, and you might want to set your default white balance more up to like 6,500 or 7,000 Kelvin or cloudy. Because if you're shooting in RAW, you can always fix it later. And if it makes you feel better about your picture, it's okay not to go with my default, but I tend to run daylight for my white balance. And those top set of settings are really ones that I set it, and I probably almost never, I'm not going to say never change. I do change them sometimes, but I rarely change them. That's not something that's sort of my camera defaults. Stability and drive modes. Again, tripod, I'm defaulting to single shot, and I'm going to shoot with a delay or a self timer. If I'm handheld, it's going to be continuous and no delay. So I like to have my drive mode set as a quick option, as well as my release being also a quick option. So I can quickly enable that timer or quickly turn it off one way or the other. Image review, talked a little bit about this. Make sure to have the histogram enabled in that playback button. Make sure that's there. If you can have highlight warnings enabled, the little blinkies, the zebras, well worth doing because that's going to tell you if you're overexposing. And I mentioned earlier, I don't like to have the image review turned on by default because I feel it interrupts my flow. So I like to turn it off. I think ultimately it makes you more efficient in the field, but I know that can be a habit that's hard to break, but I like it off. And then focus behavior, back button focus. I'm a big fan of that. And single point focus. Those are things I rarely change when it comes to that. Moving on. Things I like to keep easily accessible. The obvious, of course, right? Shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Make sure you know where those are at for what mode you're in. Those are the settings you're going to change the most often. Make sure those are readily accessible. Those are pretty much a given. If you do use some of the auto modes, make sure that exposure compensation is right at hand. That's super convenient for you to tell the camera what you're looking at. Exposure bracketing, you can do it manually, or you can use your camera's auto mode. So make sure you know where that is at. And then, yeah, make sure you know where that exposure bracketing is. It's very handy. Exposure bracketing is one of those things where a lot of times I find people, they know they've got the ability to do it automatically, but because it's buried in the menu, they don't use it. So take the time, play with it a little bit at home, and play with it in your living room, and map it to something that's convenient. That way, when you find yourself out in a fast-moving scene and you're like, I just want to bracket this thing, you can grab it from a quick menu or a function button. I like to keep focus mode. Like I said, I do that AFS, the single servo. I want it to get focus, keep focus. That's what I want most of the time. Focus point, I like it to be a point, and I do like to keep my focus stacking close at hand. So I put that into a quick function menu as well. Because again, very similar to exposure bracketing. It's one of those that it's super handy to have, but if it's buried in the menu, you either fight it out in the field trying to look for it because you remember it's somewhere. But if you take the time to put it in a readily accessible place, you're more likely to use it. And when you do use it, it won't knock you out of your creativity, your creative zone. You'll get to focus in on it. And then stability, IBIS, I like to be able to turn that off or on again, because if I'm on a tripod, sometimes I want it off. And in drive mode, I'm single shot on a tripod, continuous when I'm handheld. So I need those close at hand to be able to adjust for the situation. Again, these are things I find useful. If you are out in a situation and you find yourself using some setting that I haven't referenced, take advantage of that quick menu and get it mapped into that quick menu. You may find something you use more frequently than I do. Put it in that quick menu because it's keep you from having to dive into those menus. Anytime you find yourself accessing some setting in the field multiple times on a shoot and you're digging through menus for it, make a note on somewhere on your phone. And when you get home, find a way to map that into your quick menu so that it's readily accessible. And again, trying to keep you in that creative mindset as opposed to breaking that concentration. So again, if you're hunting for a setting more than once or twice, put it in a quick menu or map it to a button. And again, what I've suggested here may not work for you. You may want a warmer white balance. That's totally fine. You may have some other setting that you like to access frequently. Go ahead and map that as well. Again, the goal is small changes as conditions evolve. That's what the whole point of this is. Get these, that you want to reduce the friction. You want to find a set of default settings that handle most situations or get you close, and make small adjustments. And anything you do need to adjust, try to keep them quick and easy to get to so that you'll do it in the field and able to do it quickly. That results in less time in the menus and more intentional changes as the conditions do change quickly. And just one scenario here real quick, we're going to do tripod versus handheld, considering it's the same scene, different constraints, how decisions change in the field. So on a tripod, probably looking at a single shot, self-timer or delay, and then you probably don't need IBIS on a tripod. So again, all of these should have been quick settings. They're easy to change. If I'm on a tripod and suddenly I'm going to take it off and move, I have 3 settings I want to change. But if I've mapped them, then I can do continuous. So I hold the shutter, gets multiple shots, bump my shutter speed up a little bit, might necessitate an ISO change, and then turn my IBIS back on. It's in a quick menu for me. I quick 2 spots and I am IBIS on and I'm ready to shoot handheld. Again, predictable decisions lead to calmer decisions in the field, which lets you be more creative. And that's what I have. Like I said, there was a lot of information in here. I'm happy to share the PowerPoint afterwards. I think it was recorded as well. But again, my whole goal here is take a little bit of time, configure those settings that you need to make a lot, get them set to sensible defaults, whatever those are for you, map them to quick menus, and it'll just make your time in the field much, much more enjoyable because the camera won't be getting in your way and you can focus on the creative. So I am open to any questions if people have questions, but I appreciate all the time you've given me to talk about this.
Is there anyone that has a question for Jeffrey? You can either put it in chat or do it by audio.
So in chat, there's a, are you mirrorless now? Yes, I am mirrorless now. I use a Nikon Z7 II for my main camera and a Nikon Z5 II for my secondary camera. I came from D750s, Nikon D750s, but I'm mirrorless now. Yeah, so coming from DSLR is, I don't think one of my DSLRs, I couldn't do the histogram on the live view. So that's why I used the playback on it. I made sure I had that configured. But yeah, all of these are pretty much, it was a seamless transfer for me going from DSLR to mirrorless when I made that move. How am I doing focus stacking now? So It depends on the situation. Sometimes I manually focus stack. And I'll just move my focus point through. Otherwise, I use Nikon's focus shift shooting, which is its automated focus stacking. And I have it configured under a quick menu. So then I set my focus point to my closest thing in my scene. I go into my focus shift, and on Nikon, you go into it, you click start, and it does it automatically and captures however many pictures it thinks I need. And then when I bring it home, I do use Helicon Focus instead of Photoshop to stack them. But I alternate between doing it manually, depending on the scene, and automatically. But I use focus shift when I do it automatically on the Nikon.
Yeah, I got a question. You said you use autofocus a lot,
I do.
and I use manual almost all the time, but I never have the focus compensation useful. I just use the histogram.
Mm-hmm.
And do you find it an advantage to use the autofocus or the aperture priority over the manual in cases like that?
So the histogram's the best way to do it. And if I'm on a tripod, I always shoot manual, so I'm using the histogram to do those. When I'm on a tripod, I'm very deliberate. When I'm handheld, just so I can move faster, I tend to switch to aperture priority. And that's probably a throwback to my portrait days when I used to do events and stuff like that. But when I'm handheld, I tend to go to aperture priority. And then I'll use the exposure compensation. But so it sort of depends. If you're a tripod shooter most of the time, I would be in manual all the time. I'd never use aperture on the tripod. It's only when I'm handheld that I use aperture priority. But I do use exposure compensation if I'm using aperture priority to get what I want. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, okay. That was interesting.
Yep.
Well, if there aren't any other questions, I want to thank you, Jeffrey, for joining us tonight. It was very information-packed presentation. We appreciate that. And, thanks for being with us. And
Oh, one more question do I ever float my ISO? I assume you're talking about like auto ISO, I think. If you're talking auto ISO, sometimes I'll use auto ISO, mainly if I'm been talked into photographing a wildlife, though. I don't use it much on landscape, but auto ISO I will use if I'm photographing. Like if I'm in the Smokies and I know I'm going to be photographing bears, I will sometimes enable auto ISO. For those that aren't aware, I can tell I control aperture and shutter, and it's managing the ISO for me. It's nice for fast moving scenes, like if a bear's moving across a pasture.
Okay. I got one other question. On my Sony, I can map my exposure to my focus point. So I take a lot of pictures of uh, birds as portraits, and that's probably why I use it a lot. But do you think that's a wise idea in landscapes?
For landscapes, I don't. If you're photographing birds that way, I think that is a good idea, because what do you want most exposed properly? You want the bird, right? So if you're focusing on the bird, that's what you also want well exposed. For landscapes, I still prefer like a matrix evaluative scene, because you've got so much more going on in your scene that if you put it just where you're focusing, if you're focusing on a dark rock, it might throw the rest of the scene off because it's trying to make that rock just perfect, and it might cause problems with a leaf off in the corner. So for landscape, when you care more about the whole scene, that's why I like matrix. But for how you're using it for birds, I think that focus on the focus point is smart, because you've got where your focus point is also where you care the most about your exposure.
Okay, thank you. Really good. Really enjoyed this.
Good. Glad it was helpful. Cool. Well, thanks everybody. I appreciate you having me. I really appreciate it. If anyone has any questions afterwards, I'm sure someone can relay it, or my contact information's on the screen. Feel free to reach out.
Thank you.
thanks again, Jeffrey.
Yep. Thanks everybody.
pretty technical.
No, that was very good.
But I guess I better figure out where my histogram is. I've never.
I keep telling you that all the time to use